Welcome to session 7 of the Gibbs Compass certification training in Jung's psychological types. In this session, we will review the theater of oppositions, uniting opposites as one, the unfolding of personality, the symbol and the transcendent function, the spiraling path to the middle, the universal way to the middle, individuation and civilization, and the big and sacred work. With this session, we return to the theater of individuation and see it through a new filter as the theater of oppositions. We now address one of the most important issues of the training, the union of opposites as a central feature of individuation. Individuation is one of the most important ideas to come along in 2,000 years. Jung's depth psychology is centered in this all-important idea, as is his model of psychological types. The integration of opposing type dispositions is essential for the unification of the unique personality. For personality to be fully expressed, to be fully adaptable, all 8 orientations are needed. Personality itself is a mystery. The personality includes both the conscious and unconscious elements of the psyche. What personality is exactly is virtually impossible to fully define. We only know the experience of it, and have observed some of the attributes of personality in ourselves and others. Personality is the I, who we are at our core, the one who unifies the many ego identities we've taken on, the various personas we've worn. Personality includes the ability to transcend the opposites, to see from the middle, both what is in the light and in the shadow. It includes a consciousness of consciousness itself, a form of consciousness that is apparently unavailable to other forms of life in our world. Only we can imagine a Hamlet or an Eroica symphony. Only we can conceive of a critique of pure reason. We look fore and aft. We learn from the past, and we have the capacity to project an imagined and enhanced future. The consciousness of consciousness itself is a place from which we may govern the many conversations, urges, and identities swirling within us. If we're successful in governing the inner and outer expressions of our lives, then, said the original teacher of the Christian religion, we are greater than one who can govern a whole city. It is clear that the ego alone does not know the way. Hence, it is impossible to achieve individuation by conscious intention, for conscious intention leads infallibly to a conscious attitude, which excludes whatever does not fit in with it. So much conflict and difficulty arise from the ego's excluding whatever does not fit with it. The opposing orientations tend to be suppressed and less available. The classic oppositions pit thinking against feeling, sensation against intuition. But we know that the directional attitudes substantially alter those oppositions, rendering functions with shared directional attitudes highly compatible. Thus, introverted sensation and introverted intuition become close cousins, as would extroverted feeling and extroverted thinking. When we consider the oppositions from the shadow, we must consider this more nuanced and defined condition for the functions. As Jung noted, it can be hazardous to attempt to access the deepest shadow type directly. In therapy, it is the shadow type's auxiliary that is more accessible. In the diagram, introverted feeling is deepest in the shadow, and extroverted thinking is in the lead. Introverted feeling, as a normal governor of the lead type, will whisper gently from the unconscious that morality and ideals ought to be considered in concrete decision-making. Should that mild voice from the unconscious be ignored and suppressed, it will torment the individual with unruly complexes, seeking to undermine what the lead values most. The path in therapy to the deepest shadow will be through the auxiliary. The diagram shows a very practical person grounded in extroverted thinking and extroverted sensation. Extroverted sensation will be less combative with introverted intuition by virtue of their auxiliary positions. In therapy, it could be helpful to address the auxiliary introverted intuition from the standpoint of the auxiliary extroverted sensation. For example, if the analyson depicted in this diagram has had a sharp conflict with a coworker who leads with introverted feeling, and each is projecting shadow onto the other, an analyst might ask, how might you have responded differently in that argument? What might be some of the practical changes you could make in your response to that individual? The shadow's auxiliary intuition would be drawn on to imagine a different practical response, and possibly also recruit the empathy of feeling in seeking to understand the other. Well, that's the therapeutic context, but what about everyday life? These two quotes from Jung have much to say about the ongoing process of individuation. The persona is always identical with a typical attitude dominated by a single psychological function, for example, by thinking, feeling, or intuition. This one-sidedness necessarily results in a relative repression of the other functions. In consequence, the persona is an obstacle to the individual's development. The dissolution of the persona is therefore an indispensable condition for individuation. The meaning and purpose of the process is the realization in all aspects of the personality originally hidden away in the embryonic germplasm, the production and unfolding of the original potential wholeness. The hero's journey, as Campbell termed it, the journey to wholeness and the full expression of unique personality, happens continually as we become more self-aware and begin to acknowledge the many diverse identities seeking unification. There can be growth in the common practice of simply paying attention. We are presented with abundant clues that lead to the unification of personality. For example, we may feel hooked by a negative projection onto someone. That is, we may have a lot of affect about our distaste for someone. That's a clue. Especially feeling the emotional affect of dislike suggests that we may be projecting our own shadow content onto another. At those times when we notice that we have been or are being hooked, we could pause to consider what it is within ourselves that we may not want to face, or that which is inconsistent with the persona we are presenting to the world. We might be thinking, he is so phony and superficial. I can't stand being around him. But if we pause to consider how in our lives we may have been phony or superficial, it can reduce the emotional affect being projected onto another. Personal judgments of those kinds can be clues. One path to growth and to a life less propelled by shadow disruptions is to observe our own qualities that may be projected onto others. The shadow identity is everything the ego identity does not want to be. If we're highly intellectual and are invested in our own brilliance, then we may judge people who seem banal, ignorant, or superficial. The judgment is to a high degree unconscious and may compel an abrupt response until we notice the clue, as an objective observer, that something within us is the hot lava for the volcano of our abrupt response. Or we may be highly social, relating easily and frequently to others. At a party, we may hear ourselves judging a small group of introverted people who are talking quietly and intensely because they're not joining the party we organized. And furthermore, they're not smiling much. We hear ourselves ask, I wonder if they're talking about me. They're so secretive. Sometimes we may get tripped up, find ourselves entangled and stressed by some action or decision that requires one or more of our shadow types. They will be harder to access, more stressful to engage, and can leave us feeling exhausted. If the struggle to engage the shadow identity stretches the ego identity to the limits, Jung notes that's a good thing. With the ego worn out and directionless, the self steps in to take up the leadership. The leadership may arrive in many guises, sometimes as a dream, sometimes as a symbol, sometimes as a thought, sometimes as a conversation that illuminates a middle way. Projections from the unconscious can also be positive. For the sake of clarity, we will say that all positive projections are projections of the soul, while all negative projections are projections of the shadow. It's not clear that Jung would agree with that simple distinction, but it would be helpful to draw that distinction in our conversations about the unconscious. We react both to what we intensely dislike and to that which enthralls and resonates within us. The soul, like the shadow, holds that which we have yet to become, and the soul's projections are easier to adjust to. They send us in the direction of the growth and possibilities that lie before us. They are easier and lighter in many ways than in assessing the shadowy urges and compulsions from a suppressed past. When people have a certain attractive glow about them, they represent qualities that are alluring. Of course, we can project too much of a halo onto the other without recognizing what wants to be born within ourselves. When we do, we might get uncontrollably hooked by the unconscious. An anima or animus possession can be overpowering. We can virtually lose ourselves in another. So the day-to-day hero's journey of spiraling growth toward wholeness is aided by living our lives in the middle, in the consciousness of personality that transcends ego and shadow identities. It can feel as though we are standing on a hilltop, gazing down at conflicting identities in a swirl at the base of the hill. Rather than living in the swirl, we observe the many clues arising from the engagement. To take up the daily practice of individuation is a task that requires no small amount of diligence. There's so much to notice. Notice what wears us down. Notice when we feel awkward or ill at ease. Notice when we're full of frustration or stressed. Notice what we're naturally drawn to. Notice when we are feeling enthusiasm. Notice the synchronicities when the outer life seems unusually reinforcing or consistent with the inner life. Notice what resonates as true or good or beautiful. Notice who we want to become or are becoming. Then there are other practical approaches for consciously engaging the shadow. If we've been procrastinating or resisting doing something in particular, we can take on what we are resisting in short, measured clips. For example, organize the office for 10 minutes and stop. Attend the party for 20 minutes and leave. Consider a difficult reading for 15 minutes per day for just 3 days. Afterward, it's helpful to notice how we feel about that short experience. Often it feels pretty good, and we may feel encouraged to continue. Active imagination can also be a wonderful approach to shadow, for it can illuminate what is fruitful and enriching about negative projections, and open windows of understanding about the person onto whom we are projecting shadow. The symbol and transcendent function constitute the classic Jungian pathway to individuation. The symbol overarches ego and shadow dispositions to include both. The transcendent function enables the bridge that unifies them. Of the symbol, Jung said, "For we are dealing with an eternal image, an archetype, from which man can turn away his mind for a time, but never permanently. Whenever this image is obscured, his life loses its proper meaning and consequently its balance." And in the introduction to the book, The Secret of the Golden Flower, Jung wrote, "The golden flower is the light. What color is the light? One uses the golden flower as a symbol. It is the true energy of the transcendent great one. If any attain this one, he becomes alive. If he loses it, he dies." The hero's journey of individuation is a persistent spiraling up, enhancing life. These significant but invisible elements lying under the surface of consciousness are instrumental in rendering the individual more whole, more purposeful, more real, as they unite the shadow and ego oppositions in one unique individual. Louise Marie von Franz understood that spiraling up and how it feels to know someone who is on the voyage of individuation. She wrote, "It is a spiral, not a circle. The movement does not go in circles, it goes forward in spirals. This means that you always return to the same point, but on a higher level. For instance, if you meet a person who has individuated, you can say, oh, this is still old John Smith, completely, in the sense of the word. He is still the good old John Smith I once knew. But he's on a higher plane. There is something more mature, more conscious, more calm. And wherever he was is more intensely there and more real. This higher consciousness is something you feel about another person. You have a feeling that this is the same old person, but somehow he is more worthy, more intense, more real, more himself. But it is something you can only feel. The ancient sages and religions of old seem to know the way to personality unification. From India, we read, the self, smaller than small, greater than great, is hidden in the heart of this creature here. Man becomes free from desire and free from sorrow when, by the grace of the Creator, he beholds the glory of the self. And then from the Mideast, in truth and very truth, I tell you, unless a man has been born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. The ancient sages from east to west seem to know that we must step away from our ego identity and be born anew, in the middle, in concert with the self, as a personality self-aware of both ego and shadow dispositions. They seem to know that love heals. Love for another enables love for the shadow side of oneself. The love is the desire to do good to another. Love can be a means of releasing the power of projections and complexes. They knew that to be connected to the infinite, you could not be attached to the ways of this world. They taught forgiveness, not revenge, compassion, not disinterest. They seem to know that we hold the infinite within us, in the very nucleus of our personality. We are not drops in the ocean, said Rumi. We are the ocean in a drop. The unique individual personality is the all-important issue for the progress of civilization. It is not the masses that advance a civilization, but individuals. Jung noted, the great events of world history are at bottom profoundly unimportant. In the last analysis, the essential thing is the life of the individual. This alone makes history. Here alone do the great transformations take place, and the whole future, the whole history of the world ultimately springs as a gigantic summation from these hidden sources in individuals. He said, I'm neither spurred on by excessive optimism nor in love with high ideals, but am merely concerned with the fate of the individual human being, that infinitesimal unit on whom a world depends and in whom, if we read the meaning of the Christian message aright, even God seeks his goal. The aim of this training has been to give you some of the knowledge and tools that would enable you to assist people in more fully developing their unique individuality, their unique personality, their unique contribution to life, and to enable them to live with a greater sense of fulfillment and happiness in the process. We can acknowledge the leadership of a numinous self that guides and directs our lives, creating problems when we are off course and offering encouraging stamina and energy when we are aligned. The Imago Dei is the image of wholeness toward which our lives are urged to move. If we follow that guidance, we discover the riches of a life of meaning and purpose. Jung wrote, "The main interest of my work is not concerned with the treatment of neurosis, but rather with the approach to the numinous. But the fact is that the approach to the numinous is the real therapy, and inasmuch as you attain to the numinous experiences, you are released from the curse of pathology." He wrote, "The decisive question for man is he related to something infinite or not? That is the telling question of his life. Only if we know that the thing which truly matters is the infinite can we avoid fixing our interest upon futilities and upon all kinds of goals, which are not of real importance. In the final analysis, we count for something only because of the essential we embody. And if we do not embody that, life is wasted. If we remain burrowed in our one-sided, egocentric identities, we are beset by complexes and oppositions from the unconscious. Do we want to become more real? This is a central question of life. Do we want our lives to have enduring meaning and value? Then we must connect to the infinite within us. Do we want to live with greater happiness and character? There is no enduring happiness without the growth of character. Or do we prefer to live selfish, egocentric lives that are fragmented and rattled by raucous complexes? Then the course is simple. Choose a one-sided ego identity and stick with it. If we want to unify our full selves, to unite ego and shadow, dissolve the persona and grow the soul, then we must choose to allow the self to unify our personality, grow our character, and deliver a connection to the infinite that engenders enduring happiness. This is the central choice of life. The way is broad to an egocentric life, and many choose it. The way is narrow that leads to a unified personality, and few find it. Yet it is the way to the full expression of unique personality, our greatest personal potential, and our connection to the infinite.